All right, everybody. Time for us to get started in our study of God's Word. Turn to Daniel, the 4th chapter. Daniel chapter 4, as we begin our study of God's Word, which is part of the spiritual growth process of worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost. And those are the things we need to be doing so that we may grow to God's glory. And ultimately, that's why we do everything. It's not ultimately for our salvation, but even our salvation is ultimately to God's glory. And that's the purpose for everything. So, we are going back to Daniel. So in this quarter, as we have begun our study of the captivity and the return from captivity and the years of silence over these 2 quarters, we'll be studying that. We have studied the first 3 chapters of Daniel, and then we switched to Ezekiel. And we covered a lot of Ezekiel, a lot or most of the first 2 sections of Ezekiel. And now we're going back to Daniel. Now that the temple has been destroyed and everything, we're back in the book of Daniel. So why is that? Sorry, that was loud. Why are we switching back and forth like that? Yeah, so we're studying the portions of Daniel and Ezekiel and some other prophets we'll be studying, the portions that serve the narrative of the captivity and the return from captivity and so forth. So we'll be in Daniel for the next 5 classes, today included. Then after that, we'll start into the return from captivity. And that study, of course, will continue next quarter as we continue studying the return from captivity and the years of silence. So before we kind of jump in, I want to make sure, since we have now left Ezekiel for good, we're not coming back to Ezekiel in our study. What did we say? What is the main message of the book of Ezekiel? Exiles need to repent. All right? So think of E of Ezekiel, think of E of exiles. Exiles need to repent. See, it's easy. Ezekiel, it's easy. Exiles need to repent. Okay. What about the book of Daniel? How do we summarize that? Do you remember what the D stands for? Dominion. Okay, so we try to give you these little memory tools. And the acronym for Daniel, so it's God's dominion, what? Above the nations in an evil land, which is Babylon. So Brian brilliantly came up with that, and I hated it at first, and then more I thought about it, the more genius I saw it was, and I had to admit it. So God's dominion above the nations in an evil land. And so the captivity is going on now. So we've had, the first captivity was in year, all right, 605. All right, that's the one that Daniel and his 3 friends were taken in. Okay, and then the second captivity was in what year? 597. That's the one that Ezekiel and like 10,000 Jews was taken in. That was a bigger phase of the captivity. And then the third phase of the captivity happened when Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. What year was that? 586. So remember those 3 years if you can. 605, 597, 586. So 586 was the destruction. That was a mass exile of just all the rest of the people who were left in the land and everything. And so now, Nebuchadnezzar's just mad. And that was just his fury and his wrath on Jerusalem. And God using Nebuchadnezzar as that tool. So we're going to be in Daniel 4. And I really love Daniel 4. It's a very unique chapter in some ways, as you'll see. We're going to study about Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, being humbled. So he was very arrogant, and God humbles him, and then God exalts him again after he is humbled and recognizes God. Here's the lesson that's driven home over and over. This is going to be so practical for our lives and helpful for us in so many ways. The Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. The Most High meaning the Most High God. He has called that over and over and over in this chapter. The Most High. So He rules over the kingdoms of men. So let's start here in the first 3 verses of Daniel chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar the king to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth. Now that's an introduction if I've ever heard one. May your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are His signs and how mighty are His wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and His dominion is from generation to generation. This is so odd. It almost sounds like an introduction to one of Paul's letters or something. This sounds like something a prophet would say. And who's saying this? Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Chaldeans, the king of Babylonia, and a wicked nation that was. Remember Habakkuk? You know, Habakkuk, how could you use the Chaldeans to come and destroy Jerusalem? They're more wicked than your own people. They were wicked. This is a wicked nation, and this was a wicked king, but at this point, he has come to a knowledge of God. And I want you to think of the irony here. This isn't just a pagan king. This is the king that destroyed Jerusalem, that destroyed the temple, that destroyed the kingdom, as it were. I mean, the king was removed, right? No more kings there now, and yet this king, this pagan king himself is saying, I want people all over the world to know that Yahweh, of course he says the Most High, and that's kind of the term for Yahweh in this chapter, that His kingdom is everlasting. So the kingdom was gone in Jerusalem, right, in Judah, but God's kingdom will never end. It's just so powerful. Now let me ask y'all a question. Why do you think this section is at the beginning of the chapter? These first 3 verses, this introduction, why do you think it's at the beginning of this chapter? I mean, this would almost sound like something you would have at the end of the chapter or something. What are your thoughts on that?
It shows an esteem for God.
Absolutely. Shows an esteem for God.
The new beginning.
Okay, good. What is this whole chapter, do you think? If this introduction is from the king himself, what do you think the whole chapter is?
One would think it would be about the glory of God, and it ends up being that way, but it's about the arrogance of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes. He is telling this story. Daniel 4 is dictated by Nebuchadnezzar. This chapter apparently is a letter that was sent out to the whole kingdom of Babylonia. All over. And this was the world empire. This is the most powerful man on earth. And he is wanting to communicate to everybody everywhere this story that taught him that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. Now, kind of think about that as we go through this chapter. He's telling some pretty embarrassing stuff about himself. But he's telling it. He wants it to be known so that people will know that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. So powerful. This is a pagan king doing more evangelism than any of us will ever dream to do in our lifetime. This pagan king comes closer to a true knowledge of God than any other pagan king. So, and this is going to be the last we hear of Nebuchadnezzar. You know, the last we study of him in this chapter. This is kind of our send-off to him. And I don't know. I don't know where he is in eternity, because he still didn't understand some things, as we're going to see, but I hope he made it. I hope we're going to be there with him in heaven. But I don't know that. But I have hope. So let's move forward. Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great tree, here in verses 4 through 18. So Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, things were going great for him in the kingdom, but he has this terrifying dream, and he sends for his wise men to come and tell him the dream. Now, it's a little different than Daniel 2. He has a dream there, but there he forgets his dream. Remember that? And he says, you have to tell me both the dream and its interpretation. Of course, they couldn't do that. Here, he remembers the dream, but he just wants them to tell the interpretation, but they can't even do that. Of course, they can't. They don't have the Spirit of God at all. So how could they do that? Okay? So they come and they can't help him, and then Daniel comes. And I just love how he talks about Daniel in verse 8. Well, I like some things he says about Daniel. He says, "But finally Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him." Belteshazzar was Daniel's Babylonian name. That was the name he was given once he was taken into captivity. His 3 friends were given Babylonian names. We talked about that several classes ago. Does anybody remember what Belteshazzar means? Hint, Bel. Yeah, it's Bel's prince. This is Bel's prince, Daniel. And the king uses his name a lot in this chapter, and he even points out, according to the name of my God. So I think that shows that the king, he believes that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and has this eternal kingdom. Maybe he believes that Yahweh is the most powerful God or something like that, but he still certainly believes in other gods. He still believes in his Bel God, right? So he didn't have a complete knowledge like he needed to. But he says that in Daniel was a spirit of the holy gods. Now, does anybody have something different there? Does anybody have it where it says a spirit of the holy God, singular? Anybody have that there in verse 8?
The.
Okay. And it says God like singular, but not God's plural. Anybody else have that? Okay. A lot of y'all? Okay. So that's King James, New King James? Yeah, Pew Bibles, New King James. Is that right? Okay. So, so the New American Standard and some other versions says Spirit of the Holy Gods, and King James and New King James says Spirit of the Holy God. So the thing is, it's the word there. Actually, this section in the original text is in Aramaic. Now, let me just kind of take a rabbit trail for a second. The Bible was written primarily in what 2 languages? Hebrew and Greek. Old Testament, New Testament, Hebrew and Greek. But you've probably heard that there are portions of the Bible that are written in Aramaic. Have you heard that before? And of course, there are statements, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that were in Aramaic in the New Testament. Jesus actually didn't speak normally in Hebrew. It was in Aramaic. That was the common language in Palestine. So here, this is one of the sections in the Old Testament that is actually in Aramaic. If you kind of back up to chapter 2 and verse 4, where it says, the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. Starting in that verse, the original text switches from Hebrew to its sister language, Aramaic. And from chapter 2, verse 4 through the end of chapter 7, that whole section is in Aramaic. So this whole section in chapter 4, where the king is speaking, of course the king would have spoken in Aramaic. The Jews didn't learn Aramaic till they went into captivity. And so it kind of reflects that here in this section. Also, there are 2 sections in Ezra that also reflect communication that would have been in Aramaic is communicated there in Ezra, 2 different sections, and there are a couple other verses. So that's just a side note. So coming back to what I was saying, the word for God or gods is a word that corresponds to the Hebrew word Elohim. Have you heard of that word, Elohim? And so that word can be translated singular or plural, depending on the context. Isn't that neat? Because God is a Godhead. So it's neat that you could translate that plural, depending on the context. And so what we have here, this word here could be translated God singular or God's plural, depending on the context. Now, what do you think? This is Nebuchadnezzar speaking, of course, and he's saying Daniel has a spirit of the holy gods in him. That would reflect his still paganistic, polytheistic thinking. Or he's saying Daniel has a spirit of the holy God, meaning Yahweh. I'm just kind of curious, how many think that maybe this is talking about God's plural? Put your hand up. I do. I think that's probably what Nebuchadnezzar was actually meaning. But I could be wrong. So do the rest of y'all think that it's holy God singular? I'm just curious. Raise your hand if you think that it's holy God singular. And most everybody didn't raise your hand at all, so I don't know what you think. Okay, well, I was just curious. There's a case on either side, but I think probably the New American Standard has it correct. So anyway, said all that to just say there was something different about Daniel. the king knew this man has a connection with the divine. Okay? And I'm going to stop there because Brian's going to kind of use this passage to jump his sermon off later. And so we asked Daniel, tell me what this dream means. Then we have the dream itself. Now I'm going to stop here. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we actually look at the dream itself?
Adam, that is a name for God. And Deuteronomy 6:6 says, our Elohim is one Jehovah.
Yeah, good. Yep.
Yeah, and the opening right here, I kind of read that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I kind of read that as just a greeting. Mm-hmm. And obviously this portion is written after he had been in the field, after he had been living as a beast. I think the way I'm reading it is starting in verse 4 is when we start going chronologically. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking that verse 4 leaves off, where chapter 2 left off. And then when he's talking about, God's plural, I still don't think he quite understands that there's only one God.
No, he definitely doesn't. I mean,
so I think that the opening for me at first was a little confusing because he's saying, to the Most High God that he's talking about, in verse 8, he's talking about God's plural.
Yeah.
I think that those first three verses,
okay.
at the end.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I thought through that same process, but I still think I think the first three verses are an introduction to this whole letter of chapter 4 that was communicated, and I think even though he says God is the Most High, that still doesn't mean that he's monotheistic. Right. He still believes in other gods. So, but I see what you're saying. Yeah, I thought through that same thing. So let's start reading in verse 10. Now these were the visions in my head as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. Now let's just kind of picture this. Just see this ginormous tree. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. I mean, this is some tree. You've never seen a tree like this. This tree would have, dwarfed Mount Everest. I mean, it was just huge. I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. So let's just picture that, just see what he sees, this angel. It's called a watcher, okay? But I think that angelic watcher is the right way to understand that. He shouted out, and he spoke as follows, "Chop down the tree, and cut off its branches. Strip off its foliage, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. Yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts in the grass of the earth, and let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever He wishes and sets over it the lowliest of men." So he woke up from that just kind of curious. What does this mean? And terrified. Now, the point is pretty clear there at the end of the dream. The point is the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't know what the tree meant and what this tree being cut down and all that stuff. This was very odd, very, very odd to him. Let me ask you all a question. Why do you think it's so important for God to communicate to Nebuchadnezzar, particularly, the truth that the Most High, rules over the kingdoms of men? Why was it important for him to realize that truth?
God was the one that allowed him to rule over the men, all the kingdoms of the earth. He's the one that gave him that power to do that.
Good. And what about specifically regarding Jerusalem? Why would God want Nebuchadnezzar to know God's in charge to Nebuchadnezzar who destroyed Jerusalem?
Because that was God's temple.
God let him do that. It wasn't that Nebuchadnezzar was so powerful that he was able to overpower Yahweh and destroy the temple. God allowed him to do that. He purposed for him to do that as his weapon, as his tool of destruction against his wicked people. Right? So as we move forward here, Daniel interprets the dream. Daniel, in verse 19, once he heard about this dream, he was alarmed. He was appalled. Now, why was he appalled and alarmed by the vision? Why do you think Daniel responded that way? We understand why the king would respond that way. Why would Daniel respond that way to the king's dream? I think he's alarmed because he knows he's got to communicate this. Miss Joy?
That's what I was going to say. And when he tells Nebuchadnezzar what the dream means, Nebuchadnezzar may decide to have him killed.
Right. I mean, you're standing before a king, and you've got to tell the king, by the way, you're going to kind of lose your mind and be insane, and you're going to live like an animal and be driven from your kingdom, and then come back to your kingdom and stuff. I mean, that's a scary message to have to give to a king, you know. You wouldn't want to do that. Now, Daniel's response, so the king, after Daniel says that, after Daniel was apparently alarmed, the king said to him, don't be alarmed by this. So he's comforting Daniel. And then Daniel responds at the end of verse 19, my Lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries. There is a tenderness in this relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. They're being very kind to each other, very respectful. What can we learn from Daniel's tactful response to the king here? I'm going to have to tell you bad news, but I wish this was true about your enemies and not you, O king. What can we learn about that? Brian?
Some people are almost like happy to give someone bad news just to see their reaction.
Okay.
So don't be happy about that.
Yeah. People that don't serve God, they're all going to hell, and almost like we're glad to give that. No, that's a terrible message that we don't want to have to give. That's something we rejoice about. Anybody else? Remember what Peter said in 1 Peter 2 about the king? What did he say? How are we supposed to treat the king? Honor the king. This is Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel is showing him honor because he's in the position of king. And we need to remember that. So as he goes on describing the interpretation of the dream, he tells him this great tree that spread everywhere and fed all the animals and everything, that's you, O king. And he specifically says in verse 22, it is you, O king, for you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. So what was Nebuchadnezzar depicted as? What part of the dream in Daniel 2 represented Nebuchadnezzar? Do you remember that? The head of gold. So there he was the head of gold. Here he is this tree that fills the entire earth. All right, as he goes on, he explains about this angelic command, the command that the angel gave to cut down the tree and leave the stump. Why would he have to say leave the stump? Do they have stump removal services back in ancient Babylon? I've got 3 stumps in my yard. And one of them's right in the middle of the landscaped area, right in front of my house. And I know that I need to get rid of those things, and I don't. But that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to remove the stump. I imagine back in this day they would have burnt it to the ground. So the angel specifically says, leave the stump. Make sure it's not destroyed. Actually, what did he say to be put around it? All right, this band of bronze and iron. What do you think that represents?
Something being reserved.
It'd be protected, and its roots would be left intact, and everything. Now, what did Daniel say that represents? Why was this stump left intact?
It was going to be preserved for Nebuchadnezzar.
All right, so Nebuchadnezzar was going to be removed for a while from his sovereignty, but he would come back. He would be restored, right? And so the roots of the stump and the stump itself were left for that reason. What about the other aspects? This whole thing about the grass, the stump is out here in the grass and the dew of heaven is there on it. What does that mean?
I think it represents
Remembrance.
Okay.
For the people should remember what that tree did.
Okay.
Or the king.
But so specifically, how did that apply to the king? This whole thing of the grass and the dew and everything. Without us just reading, I want you to just kind of tell me.
Debbie's got it.
Yes.
Well, I think if the tree's cut down and it's protecting everything and providing for everything, that it represents that now Nebuchadnezzar does not have the protection and the guidance of God.
Yeah. So what do the grass and the dew represent? Y'all?
God's here.
I'm sorry? Okay. He's going to live like an animal and eat grass. Not literally eating grass. No, a human can't just eat grass and live, but things out there and foliage and stuff like that you can find that you can actually eat. He's going to live like an animal. The dew of heaven's going to be on him. He's not going to have shelter over him. And he's going to be out there for how long? Till 7, whatever you might say. I don't know if it'd be 7 weeks or 7 months or 7 years, or if 7 is just some symbolic number because it's kind of a number for completion, and God is just saying until a complete period of time, enough time passes for him to learn the lesson. He's going to live like an animal. Okay, until, and at the end of verse 25, until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever He wishes. There we see the main point again. The Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. Then in verse 27, we have this rebuke. I say it's a rebuke. He says, therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. A couple of questions for y'all. So if we can get a little conversation generated. What was Daniel's motive behind his rebuke to the king?
I think it was to the king's good. He's asking him to repent, which would save his kingdom, and he wouldn't have to go through this ordeal.
Yeah. All right. Anybody have any other thoughts on that? All right. Now, somebody who hasn't answered yet. How can Daniel's example help us to rebuke people in the right way? How can Daniel's example help us to rebuke people in the right way?
By realizing that people are lost until they hear the Word of God.
Okay.
Focus, perhaps to try to get people to focus on the positive outcome that will result from it.
Absolutely. Good. Jason?
I like one thing you said earlier about Nebuchadnezzar. You said, I don't know what his eternal outcome is. I hope he made it.
Yeah.
That, as much as this, can help us. If we have the attitude, we hope you make it. We hope you make it to heaven. We love you and we want you to be in heaven.
Absolutely.
Because you're one of God's children. That will help us rebuke in the right way, because then we're not doing it to prove that we're right or to be in some argument and win. We're doing it because, you know what, I love you, I love your soul, and I'm concerned about you.
Yeah. And, I can remember asking Holly that her dad is an elder at a church in Tampa, and I can remember asking, isn't it kind of scary to have to, deal with people who need to be rebuked? Because an elder, has to do that a lot. And he said, it's not scary at all when you do it in love. I thought, well, it is to me. I mean, appreciate you saying that, but he was just, it's not scary at all. I mean, they know you're doing it because you care about them. And here Daniel is telling the king, look, you need to repent, king. He's not saying that to get on to him. He's saying that because he cares about him and he wants a good outcome for the king. So let us remember that anytime we have to address somebody in their sin. Brian?
Yeah, I think what's also amazing about this is,
Nebuchadnezzar isn't just a stranger who's lost. Like, this is a guy who ripped Daniel out of his land and just destroyed the holy city of God. And Daniel should just be hating him and should just be wishing for him to be destroyed. And yet he loves his enemy here.
Yes.
And wants his prosperity. I think that's amazing.
That is amazing. That is the king that destroyed the temple. And, It'd be easy for Daniel to wish evil on him. But look how much patience and love Daniel has. Melissa, back.
Is that, I mean, in some ways we've already said it, that this, he knew him. There was a relationship.
There was a relationship.
Relationship is such a key. Because when you go to someone and you rebuke them, or you know, man, I'm going to have to say something to them, because if I don't, they're going to be in a bad place. That if you haven't already built that relationship to them, it will not come across that way.
No, yeah, absolutely. That is a marvelous point. If we just try to approach somebody that we've never reached out to, and hey, I'm going to give you a rebuke. Well, what might they be thinking? Well, you never gave me attention before, but now all of a sudden you're going to talk to me about this concern you have? That really can rub people the wrong way. So there is a real relationship and even a tenderness between this king and Daniel. I'll take one more.
Kind of what you said about he had the respect for the king. I think it's just respecting each other as God's children. Yeah. And like you said, also not being happy to say, hey, you're doing wrong, but to come at a point from love and honor that, in our case particularly, we've all been in a place of making mistakes. And so approaching it in that way. I mean, I don't know how, I think it relates to what you're asking to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great, and to tell people, I don't want to tell you this. I found no pleasure in saying this. And just tell them, I'm saying this because I love you. And I'm just saying this because I care about you. I want the best for you. And I appreciate you hearing me out on this. And if you do that and you have a relationship, then you have a much better chance of that being received. I'll take one more. Jack, I keep seeing your hand go up, so I don't mind. You go ahead.
One of the preachers we had here said that anytime anybody started a conversation with him, I'm saying this with love.
Yes, that's great.
Said it's always a difficult one to hear.
Yes, yeah. Very good. Here's a New Testament passage. Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters, in all purity. So the dream is fulfilled, verses 28 and following. And we read in verse 28, all of this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. The king reflected and said, he's saying this out loud. I don't know to who. Maybe he's just talking to himself. Is not this Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence, by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? I did it, and I did it for me. Isn't it great? It's almost unbelievable. It's just noxious, the arrogance of this man. Now, why do you think it took 12 months before this dream was fulfilled? Kind of speculation, but what do you think? It didn't happen right away. Terry?
I think it took 12 months for him to forget the warning that Daniel gave him.
That's what I think. Hey, we can remember for a little while. We can stay motivated for a little while, but that fades away. We got to continually be reminded by God's word, and he apparently wasn't. And so he forgot after 12 months. He did good for a year, and then he let his guard down totally. Brian, did you want to say something?
I was going to say it could also be that
he was doing bad for a year, and God just was being patient and giving him more time.
That could be, yeah. That's a very real possibility. So I want to say my view is that has to be the truth. Though it probably isn't. In what ways do people, including us, struggle with pride? Now, we don't have a world empire. As I talked about a few weeks ago, we just basically have an empire of dirt, and yet we're still filled with pride about that sometimes. But in what ways do people, and you can share if you want to about your own life, struggle or have struggled in the past with pride like Nebuchadnezzar does here?
Well, thinking when you accomplish something that you've accomplished it by yourself.
All by your lonesome. Yeah. Absolutely. What do we need? What does James say our attitude needs to be about going to a city and buying, selling, and making a profit? I'm going to go and I'm going to do that. What does he say that we should say? If God wills. In other words, not just up to me. Paul says our adequacy is through Christ for everything that we do for the Lord. Good?
Terry? You hear this a lot, especially in the American culture. I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps.
On bootstraps. Yeah. Which I never understood. I don't understand that statement. Pulled myself up by my own bootstraps.
So people struggle with pride in all sorts of ways. Anything else y'all want to share about that before we move on? Jason?
Peter, and you see that pride it's not explicitly stated in every place, but it's kind of pervasive through there is the problems that pride causes. And I had to deal with myself because I was a little smart kid, and always wanted to be right and always needed to be right. And my mom and dad taught me a lesson, and one of the things was, if it's just about winning an argument, then it's just about your pride, and it's the wrong reason.
Yeah.
And we need to get past, I've got to be right. This is all about me.
Yeah.
And until we do that, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to have the attitude you expressed toward Nebuchadnezzar. Hey, I hope you made it. With pride in the way.
Sure, absolutely. The pride of always being right,
or always being first, not letting somebody else get in before us, or not letting somebody else be right. We've got to always be the one that wins the argument or whatever. In our marriages, talking to myself here, a lot of times it's just plain pride. Like, just apologize. Why don't we apologize? Why do we always have to defend ourselves and win the argument? Because we're prideful. Like, let it go and just, remember humility. So we're not going to be like, in any way, shape, or form, like Nebuchadnezzar was here in this circumstance. All right, those are good. Those are good thoughts. Very good thoughts. So, as the word was in his mouth, as he was still saying this, maybe just to himself, God spoke to him. And God said, all those things that you dreamt about, they're all going to happen. They're all going to happen. And so at that very moment, it says in verse 33, immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle. And his bird was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. Now, he wasn't transforming into a bird, but his hair grew long and matted, and it just resembled feathers. And his nails grew long. He wasn't at all trying to keep up with his body in any way, shape, or form. He apparently kind of went insane. Just living out here like an animal. And we don't know what caused it. Maybe he just literally went insane for a little while. And but then he learned his lesson. Verse 34, but at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. I mean, just picture this. Here he is. He's out in the field. He looks like an animal. He's filthy from head to toe. His hair is all long and unkempt. And I mean, he just looks rough. And picture him out there. And finally, he's looking up. He's looking up to heaven. He says, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. But he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth. And no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? This is amazing. This is one of the most profound statements of God's sovereignty in all the Bible. This rivals passages that we have in Isaiah 40 and 41 and 42 and 43 and 44 about how God can do anything and no purpose of his can be thwarted, and who can be his counselor or tell him what he needs to do. Or in Romans chapter 9, where Paul talks about the sovereignty of God, and the thing molded can't turn and say to the thing that molded it, what have you done? This passage is right up there with those passages. And yet, it was spoken by a pagan king and the pagan king who destroyed the temple. It's really, when you think about it, it's a marvelous story of redemption. How even that man could be brought to that knowledge. And it's just so amazing. Well, I don't know if you're comfortable, so I just thought I'd throw this question in there in case. What humbling experiences have you had, if you have had any, that you're comfortable sharing? What humbling experiences have you had that made you realize that God is in charge? I try to think of my own life, like, is there one moment where I was just, kind of like the prodigal son, out here eating pig's food before it finally hit me? I can't think of a turning point like that in my life. I certainly had a turning point, but it wasn't that dramatic. But does anybody have something? It doesn't have to be anything quite like Nebuchadnezzar's here, of course, but any humbling experience that you are comfortable sharing? If not, that's okay. Melissa?
I don't necessarily have an experience, but we've had the opportunity to work with a lot of men who are going through like a drug rehab, and that people who were high. I mean, some of them were super wealthy before, and they just fell, and God brought them down to their knees. And I'll tell you what, the ones who make it and they come back, you will never meet more relatable, personable, humble, grateful people in your life.
Wow.
To be in their presence.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, they just exude like God in them.
Yeah.
And that's so strong. And people who have not been through things like that and cannot relate, it's they will never have that relationship and the power that they will have to reach other people like those people do.
Yeah, I mean, people who have experienced addictions, substance abuse and things like that are really hard to kick.
Sometimes it takes them just hitting the bottom of the barrel and hitting it hard, and a lot of times they don't survive it.
We all have addictions
to sin in various ways, and so it takes a turning point for us to open our eyes, and it takes a humbling experience a lot of times. Ryan?
I think for me, sometimes I can just get so busy with life that I just stop praying like I should, and I just start noticing when I don't pray like I should, just things don't go right. And I don't mean like life isn't smooth necessarily, but like my attitude and my heart changes, and I get kind of bitter, and I get short-tempered, and I just it's a reminder to me that, well, duh, I'm trying to do everything my way. I'm not even talking to the Lord about what I'm doing anymore, and I'm just on autopilot. And that always reminds me, okay, my way doesn't work. You're in charge. You lead the way.
So I hope this kind of relates, because it's not necessarily a complete humbling experience, but I'm humbled by when I think back on periods of time in my life. There's times there, I think we all go through things that maybe we start to question things or our faith gets weak. But when I take a reflection back and I think about things in my life, and I look at even my career path, think when I was in the process, we were in the process of buying our first house, I happened to be blessed to be working at a title insurance company, which helped us through the process, helped with discounts, and helped us to know what to do. Then go up a few years, work at a hospital at a time that I have a baby, both babies. And so I know people, and I'm able to get, care, and it's things like that, and that can continue. But the same thing with my sister-in-law. We just recently had a conversation. They moved to Florida, no jobs whatsoever, and suddenly my son's job offered him to work from home for 10 years. And she had no job, but my mom's person she was working with retired, and now all of a sudden she had a job working with my mom. I mean, it was just amazing. So when you kind of reflect, I think when you go through periods of weakness in your faith, and you really take time to reflect and pray, you recognize and can be humbled by those experiences. It's not necessarily a specific humbling experience, but can be humbled by recognition of seeing God through the course of your life.
Yeah, and let that bring you to a higher place. Like
Melissa was saying a minute ago, let that strengthen you, and then use those bad, hard, terrible things you went through, like what Nebuchadnezzar does here, to help you just to honor God more. So I've got like 13 seconds. Just wanted to recap what he says here at the end of the chapter. Just look at the last verse, verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. That's the last thing we hear about Nebuchadnezzar. I hope he kept that attitude for the rest of his life. I hope we'll see him one day in heaven. And hopefully his story can be the story of some of us that can be reconciled to God. Leave you with this thought: the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. Thanks.